His hands stung with blisters, but he kept swinging. The storm was closing in, and he needed walls before dark. A man alone in the wild had two choices: build shelter or freeze. It took a lot of muscle, instinct, focus, and an axe sharp enough to cut through bone, because out there in the wild, a cabin was one of the few things that keeps a man alive. But how did these mountain men do it? How did they turn trees into shelter, fast, strong, and built to last? Well, that's what we're here to find out. My name is Matt Francisco, and this is Wild America. For centuries, people had stacked logs for warmth, safety, and survival. Long before the frontier, however, the log cabin had already proved its worth. Part 1. A History. The log cabin's roots ran deep, back to ancient Europe, where tribes stacked the logs, locking them tight at the corners. The Romans took notice. Vitruvius Pollio even wrote about it. But Scandinavia and Eastern Europe had mastered the craft long before, where winter demanded strong, weatherproof shelter. Logs, notches, no nails. The method spread across northern Europe and into Russia. Then came the colonists. Swedish and Finnish settlers landed in Delaware in 1638 and wasted no time. The forests were full of timber they knew how to use. No sawmills, no blueprints, just an axe, a saw, and the skill to turn trees into walls. Their cabins rose fast, built from sweat and know-how. The Scots, Irish, and British settlers copied the design. A single man could raise a cabin in a couple of months. With several hands, however, a basic cabin could be up in a week, but finishing took much longer. 4 walls, a roof, and a claim staked in the wild. By the 1700s, log cabins were everywhere, simple, solid, and free. Just a matter of chopping, stacking, and working the land. For settlers pushing west, a cabin meant more than shelter. It meant survival, a mark on a land that said, "I belong here." Few stories captured that spirit like Abraham Lincoln's. Born in a rough Kentucky cabin in 1809, he rode that humble image all the way to the White House. And in a nation built on grit, a man from a log cabin was one people trusted. Then came the Homestead Act of 1862, free land for anyone who'd built, farm, and stay. Wagons rolled west. Trees fell. Cabins rose. No fancy houses, no hired hands, just logs, hard work, and the promise of a new start. At first, these cabins were bare bones. 1 room, dirt floor, a single door against the cold, chinks in the walls stuffed with clay, stones, even rags. But times changed. By the mid-1800s, sawmills made log cutting easier in settled areas, but mountain men still hand-hewed their logs, using axes and adzes to smooth and shape them. Yet, in the beginning, a cabin was just a start, a shelter while a man worked the land, nothing more. Some built bigger, but plenty never did. A roof, a fire, and food on the table. And that was enough. The Scotch-Irish style kept it simple. 1 room, 16 by 20 feet, doors front and back, a stone hearth for heat. Pioneers copied the style but stripped it to the bare bones, stacked logs, mud-chinked gaps, a fire burning before nightfall. And as settlements grew, cabins got sturdier. The dog trot style, for instance, split into 2 rooms with a breezeway in the middle, cooling the house in the summer. Then there was the saddlebag next. It consisted of 2 rooms, 2 chimneys, a loft up top, a porch out front. By the mid-1800s, the wealthy man saw the charm. Cabins turned from rough shelters into retreats. The Adirondack style sealed the shift. High-peaked roofs, grand beams, built for comfort, not survival. But for a true frontiersman, a cabin was never about luxury. It was always about holding your ground, braving the wild, and proving you belonged. But history is just the beginning. Out in the wild, a man had to build a cabin. He had no instruction manual or anything. And it all started with an axe, a saw, and the will to survive. Part 2. The big picture. Now, before a man could call any place home, he had to carve it out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands. And that started with the log cabin, fast, durable, and built from whatever the land provided. First, the mountain man had to clear the land. hacking down trees, pulling up roots, making space for a cabin. Every log served two purposes: clearing ground and building walls. But not just any tree would do. He needed straight, solid trunks: pine, cedar, fir, or larch. Wood that wouldn't twist, rot, or crack too soon. Fall and winter were best for felling. Spring-cut logs peeled easier, but split bad when they dried. Worse, warm weather, on the other hand, brought insects that chewed wood to dust. Cold season timber, however, held strong. Once cut, logs were stripped of bark, notched at the ends, and stacked tight. If done right, they locked together like a clenched fist, holding strong against wind, rain, and winter's worst. After all, a cabin's main functions were to provide shelter, keep the wolves out, the heat in, and give a man a place to dry his boots and load his rifle by firelight. Often enough, it was nothing fancy: one room, dirt floor, and a single door. But as the land took shape, mountain men could even store food in the cellar and livestock in a pen. That's when the cabin grew: a loft, an extra room, maybe a porch where a man could sit and watch the wind stir through the stumps he'd cut with his own hands. Good logs needed time to dry, peeled and stacked on skids to keep them from rotting. 6 months was ideal, but most mountain men didn't have 6 months. If time was short, they worked with green logs, knowing they would shrink. This meant extra chinking was needed later. Furthermore, mountain men picked the straightest logs they could find. If a curved log had to be used, it was worked into the structure carefully, but the goal was always a tight, level fit. Either way, the better the seasoning, the stronger the cabin. However, in most cases, mountain men chose the straightest logs available and hand-hewed them to fit snugly, and often enough, it's these straightest, cleanest ones that faced the front. The thickest logs went along the bottom to bear the weight. Cabins weren't built wall by wall, they rose evenly, each log laid in turn to keep the weight balanced. Inside dimensions mattered most, outside size changed with log thickness. And if you think building a cabin is tough, try living in one, alone, for 2 years. We covered Henry David Thoreau's fight to survive at Walden Pond in an 11-hour deep dive. That story's waiting for you after this one. In the meantime, keep in mind that a cabin's corners held everything together. The best kind was the round notch, locking each log tight like a handshake. No nails, no pegs, just wood against wood holding tight. However, wooden pegs were sometimes used to help hold the logs in place. And if a man worked alone, walls stopped at 6 feet, or as high as he could lift. With extra hands, the walls were built higher, maybe adding a loft for sleeping. Most cabins ran 12 to 16 feet per side. Small enough to heat, just big enough to live. And once that last log was set, the wilderness became more of a home than just a place to live. As soon as the walls stood and the roof was on, the real work began. You see, gaps between the logs let in wind, rain, and the bitter bite of winter. That's where chinking came in. Mud or clay packed tight into every crack, sealing the warmth inside. It wasn't pretty, but it did the job. Once again, a cabin's strength was its corners. That's where everything locked in, where the walls stood firm against time and weather. A lot of mountain men favored the saddle notch, strong, snug, and designed to shed water, keeping rot at bay. Instead of cutting into both logs, the saddle notch carved only the underside of the top log, letting rain run off instead of pooling. And as the wood dried and shrank, this notch kept gaps tight, holding the cabin together season after season. Now, a skilled hand could carve a saddle notch with nothing but an axe, but the right tools made the job a whole lot smoother: chisels, saws, and so on. Cabin building, nevertheless, started with the foundation logs, 2 running lengthwise, 2 crosswise. Each was squared and hewn flat on the bottom to sit steady. Once placed, they were dogged down to keep from shifting. Then came the first saddle notch. Done right, the logs snuggled together like they'd grown that way, solid, weatherproof, and built to last. Once marked, the upper log was flipped, its underside ready for cutting. A sharp axe chopped out the bulk of the notch, and if the mountain man had a chisel on him, he could smoothen the curve. The goal is a deep enough cut so the log's weight pressed down on its edges, locking it tight. Each log followed the same process. To tighten the fit, a builder could widen the notches slightly, forcing the upper log to squeeze against the lower one as the cabin settled. So, yeah, a good saddle notch made all the difference. Done wrong and the walls twisted and gapped. Done right, they held strong against wind, cold, and time itself. Think of a cabin as a puzzle of weight and balance. The corners kept it standing. But there was also dovetail notches, which looked like a shingled roof shedding rain. Box corners were squared off but durable. Plain tenons relied on weight alone, so each method had its place, but a poor choice meant trouble down the road. Now, once the wall stood, doors and windows had to be framed right. Grooves in the back locked them into place, while the front could be smoothed or rabbeted for a doorstop. And since logs shrank as they dried, a builder left a few extra inches at the corners and openings. Without that gap, doors jammed, windows cracked, and the whole structure loosened wrong. But if done right, that cabin held stable and secure, a fortress against the wilderness. Next, it was time for the floor joists, the backbone of the cabin floor. They fit into notches carved into the bottom logs or rested on a stone foundation if the mountain man had one. Either way, they had to be solid, level, and locked in tight. A man had two ways to set them: notch them into the side logs or flatten a section of the inside wall for support. If he used pole joists, round 4 to 8 inch logs, he'd hew the tops flat so that the floorboards had a stable bed. Every log had to fit snug, no gaps, no wobbles. The corners had to stay level, measured against the floor joists. If a log sat too high, the notch was cut deeper. If one end was thicker, it got flipped to balance. Rough logs were sometimes hewn flat on the underside for a tighter fit, but the goal was always straight, plumb walls. And without modern carpenter's levels, mountain men relied on a plumb bob, a simple weight on a string, or a straight eye-measured board to keep things even. Once the walls were up, they had to be locked in place. This was done using wooden pins or, when available, iron spikes. Wooden pins were often made from tough, seasoned hardwood like oak or hickory, and they were driven through pre-drilled holes, allowing the logs to settle naturally over time. Most cabins were held together with saddle or dovetail notches and wooden pegs. Iron spikes were rarely used by mountain men, for they were found mostly in settlements. Now, early cabins were dark. Windows remained small for security and warmth. Greased paper or oiled cloth was used for windows since glass wasn't available. Some mountain men even used stretch rawhide, but it wasn't really that common. A rough cut made the openings, but final shaping waited until frames were ready, and that way everything fit tight. And as walls rose, those markings stayed in tight, scrawled onto the logs. However, when it came time to cut across a window or door, a man had to be careful. The moment a log split, its loose ends had to be held firm, or the whole wall could move out of line. Also, a mountain man didn't wait to cut doors and windows, he planned them from the start. As he stacked the walls, he marked where the openings would go and notched the logs at the corners. When it was time, he chopped through with a broad axe or adze. If he had a saw, he used it to clean the cut, but most just trusted their swing. To keep the walls from moving, the frames had to be solid, thick timber locked in tight. And since logs shrank over time, he left a small gap above the openings so doors wouldn't jam later. Furthermore, doors and windows needed frames, sturdy, thick timber, to hold the logs steady as the cabin settled. Without them, the walls could crush the openings or twist out of shape. Mountain men, however, didn't waste time with fancy joinery. Openings were framed with rough-hewn timber, secured with pegs or nails if available. Doors were made from split logs, fastened with wooden dowels or rawhide hinges. And to prevent doors and windows from jamming as the logs settled, mountain men left a small gap above each opening, later stuffed with moss, oakum, or wood shavings to block the wind while allowing the cabin to shift naturally. Tightest walls, the best chinking, and the strongest corners wouldn't matter if the roof failed. If it leaked, winter turned the place into a freezing, miserable wreck. A good roof started with what was on hand. If sawn lumber was available in a settlement, it could be used, but most mountain men relied on hand-split shakes, bark, or overlapping logs. He'd cut the top log flat so rafters could sit snug or notching it to hold them in place. Some mountain men built gable ends out of logs, stacking them high for a smooth look. Others framed them with timbers and covered them in shakes or rough planks. Shakes were the frontier standard, split from straight-grained cedar, pine, or whatever wood was handy. If a man had coin, he might trade for sawn shingles, but most split their own. It was back-breaking work, however. Logs were cut into short sections, then split with a froe, a long blade hammered with a wooden maul. Each blow sent a thick, uneven peel shaken off. Unlike thin factory shingles, these had weight, 3/4 of an inch thick, tough as the log walls below. Now, overhangs weren't just for looks. Wide eaves helped keep rain off the walls and let snow slide off instead of piling up. Purlins, strong roof beams, ran across the top logs. Spaced about 2 feet apart, some mountain men doubled them for extra support. Gable logs locked in alongside the roof logs, keeping everything solid. Also, mountain men didn't have steel flash into steel gaps. They relied on tight stacking, overlapping shakes, and, as mentioned earlier, stuffing moss or clay into cracks. If a roof wasn't built right, the first storm would prove it, and out here, a leaky roof could mean freezing to death. A shake roof might show some light from inside, but if laid right, it kept out rain, and out here, metal was rare. Wood laid right held against the storms. Now, most cabins were single room, but some mountain men needed more space, and so, if a man wanted more than one room, he had 2 choices. First, he could stack logs just like the outer walls, locking them tight at the corners, or, if he had boards to spare, he built a frame partition, a lighter wall braced between the logs, but he never conjoined it to the cabin walls. The logs settled over time, and anything attached across them would tear itself apart. Now, in regard to gap filling, some builders in Scandinavia had a different method, chinkless construction, where logs were carefully scribed to fit so tightly that no filler was needed. But frontier survival didn't allow for that kind of fine craftsmanship. A mountain man didn't have weeks to carve out perfect joints. He needed a cabin up before the first snowfall. That's why most cabins relied on saddle notches or simple dovetails, quick, strong, and good enough to hold. Now, a cabin without a fireplace wasn't much of a cabin. Without it, winter crept in fast, and a man could freeze before morning. Fire meant warmth, light, and food. It was the heart of every home. Most frontiersmen built their fireplace first, stacking rough-laid stone at the gable end before raising the walls around it. Stone didn't burn, didn't rot, and once set, it held strong against time and weather. The hearth was wide and deep, big enough to cook meals and heat the room. The foundation had to go below the frost line, dug deep so shifting ground wouldn't crack the chimney. And as usual, gaps between timber and stone were packed tight with chinking, mud, moss, or clay, sealing out drafts. In the wilderness, there were no fancy heat chambers or metal inserts. Instead, thick stone walls soaked up heat, radiating it long after the fire died down. Some men built double-thick hearths to hold the warmth even longer, and once the fireplace was set and the logs stacked around it, a mountain man might take one last step to protect his work. Outside, he rubbed bear grease or certain animal fat into the wood to fight rain and rot. Some mountain men relied on proper log selection and wide eaves for protection. It wasn't perfect, but out here, nothing was. Simple measures, but they meant the difference between a cabin that stood a few hard seasons and one that lasted a lifetime. Now, a cabin started bare. Just a table, a bed, maybe a stool if time allowed. No clutter, no extras. Everything had a purpose. If a man needed furniture, he built it himself, from the same trees that framed his walls. Lodgepole pine out west, oak or hickory back east, whatever was strong and nearby. First, the bark had to go. If left on, it held moisture and bugs. Once stripped, the wood could be shaped into beds, stools, and tables. Fancy finishes weren't really a concern. As mentioned recently, if a man wanted to protect the wood, he rubbed it down with bear fat or whatever was on hand. Even beeswax, if available. Linseed oil or pine tar works too, but it was uncommon. Rot-resistant logs mattered more. Chairs and stools were simple but built tough. Legs were wedged tight, cross-braced, or pegged with wooden dowels to keep them steady. If a chair fell apart, it wasn't the wood's fault. It meant the builder got it wrong. Benches, too, were rough-cut and strong. Lodgepole pine, birch, or tamarack joined with wooden pegs or notched tight. No glue, no screws, just solid wood locked together. And a bed was as simple as it got. 4 posts, wooden slats, or rope ladders stretched tight. Bunks followed the same rule. Built strong, no wasted effort. A mattress, if a man had one, was stuffed with straw, feathers, or dried grass. And every mountain man needed a place for his gear, a wooden chest for supplies, sometimes a shelf if he had the time. pine or tamarack worked best, cut and fitted tight with wooden dowels or hand-forged nails. As for firewood, it was stored in simple stacks or wooden bins. Side joints were pegged, not bolted, and if it had a handle, it was carved from wood. On the frontier, every choice had to be practical. A mountain man's first swing of the axe marked the beginning of his home. His last locked him into the land forever.
A mountain man lived off the land, alone, without help, without breaks. Every task meant something: eat or go hungry, patch or freeze, sharpen or die dull. But what did it actually take to survive a full day in the wild? And how did he cook, trap, tan, patch, clean, and survive? Every single day? Today we go inside the cabin, hour by hour, task by task, no myths and no reenactments, just the real routine. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Part 1. Pre-dawn. The dark forest pressed in hard. Wind whispered through the pines slowly, dragging frost from the branches like breath from a sleeping beast. Somewhere out there, a branch snapped. Inside, the cabin felt more like a cave than shelter. Fire had long since burned down, just a faint red glow buried under ash. The air wasn't sharp enough to bite, but deep enough that it settled in the cracks and crept through the moss-stuffed chinks. This kind of cold crouched. It didn't scream. And under a mess of buffalo hides, old wool, and a faded Hudson's Bay blanket, the mountain man didn't move. Not yet. He just lay there, still, alert, breath rising in pale puffs. You don't bolt upright in the wilderness unless you've got a reason. So you listen first. For an owl, for a fox. A silence meant nothing moved except the dark. And now he'd stir slow. One leg, then the other. Feet hit the dirt with a quiet thud. The floor was hard-packed earth, always cold. He wore long johns, flannel soaked with years of sweat and smoke. His rifle stood arm's reach from the cot. His hatchet was buried in the stump by the hearth. Everything in the cabin had a place, and every place had a reason. He reached for the lantern. It was an old tin thing, sheltering the flicker out of habit. It lit nothing but his boots. The deerskin flap that passed for a door twitched in the breeze, letting in the sharp breath of pine and cold. He crouched by the hearth, shoulders hunched. With a shallow breath, he'd blow softly across the coals. No rush. Fire hates a rush. Pine shavings, bark curls, twigs. The coals caught slow. Then came a sparkle. Then flame. Then light. Heat eased out inch by inch. Smoke found its way up through the chimney gap. If the draft held, it'd go. If not, it'd drop back down and stain the rafters like it had before. He didn't bother with it. You didn't fight the cabin. You learned to live with it. The place was small, barely bigger than a freight wagon. It had one room, no windows, one low cot, shelves hammered straight into the log walls with split saplings. On them, cornmeal, flour, dried apples, salt pork, jerked meat wrapped in old rags, a couple of tin pots, a powder horn, a mold for casting round ball, a squat iron kettle. Everything smelled like smoke and sweat and time. He then rubbed his hands by the fire. Breath still puffed white. Eyes glanced to the ceiling, then the wall, then nowhere. He was tracking something, thinking through yesterday's trap lines. The ones near the creek bend, the deadfall past the ridge. He saw them clear in his head. Stakes, snares, bait lines. Had the bait frozen? Had the beavers moved downstream? Could be. That last freeze laid ice thick enough to walk or fall through. Hard to tell. He grabbed the water bladder and dumped it into the kettle. If it wasn't frozen solid, it'd warm fast. If it was, he'd cut it out in chunks. He looked around again. No coffee. That was gone weeks back. Instead, he pulled sassafras bark from a pouch. Root brew wasn't much, but it was hot, and it burned its way down just fine. He cracked his shoulders loose and made a round of the cabin. Flint was tight on the lock, powder horn sealed, knife still sharp, gloves dry. He put on his boots, buckled his belt, then continued inspecting his cabin. Horn spoon, patch knife, bag of lead and patching cloth, everything's where it should be. By the door, a strip of pemmican hung like old leather. He sawed off a chunk, then chewed on it slowly. Same knife for everything, same silence in the room. He stared ahead, thinking terrain, how far he'd go, what to avoid, where the sign might be better. Then he stepped outside. Not far, just enough to breathe it in. The crusted snow crunched under his boots. Trees stood tall and still, black silhouettes. The sky was still dark but softening at the rim, stars fading behind a pale frost. Nothing moved, not yet. Back inside, the fire cracked louder now. It filled the room with orange light and spit warmth into the cold corners. He sat down, wrapped fingers around the tin mug, and sipped the bark brew. The taste was rough, but it warmed him. And that's how a mountain man's day started. Now, if you want to see how mountain men built those log cabins from scratch, we've got a full episode on that, so don't miss it. Part 2. Morning. He'd already chewed through a strip of pemmican and finished off the last of his sassafras brew, just enough to wake the gut. Now, it was time for real food. The fire popped. Heat licked the skillet as the mountain man slapped down thick slices of salt pork. No ceremony, just the morning grind. The fat hissed, spit into the flames, smoke swirling through the cabin like a signal from yesterday. That grease was gold. It kept things cooking, kept things moving. And beside the fire, he slid a chunk of cold cornbread onto a hot stone. Last of the cornmeal. It was dry and plain, but it filled the belly and held the line. The smell hit first: pork, wood smoke, and warmth. Breakfast in the wilderness wasn't much, but it stuck with you. Moments later, with his belly full, he pulled on his buckskin coat and tied the moccasins tight. No buttons, no buckles, just soft leather made for slipping quiet through the brush. He then stepped into the chill once more, air sharp enough to bite. He moved slow, careful, feet finding the same frozen path he took every morning to the stream. He then reached the stream. Cold mist hovered above the water. His traps sat half-submerged, iron jaws clamped open, waiting. He checked them one by one. These were heavy, double-spring footholds, anchored to saplings he'd driven into the riverbank days ago. The bait, castor, musky oil from beaver glands, stored in carved wooden cups. Nasty smell, but it worked. And if you're curious about the traps themselves, we've got a full episode breaking down every type mountain men used. We've also got another deep dive on the hunting methods they used to track, stalk, and take game in the wild. So check those out if you haven't already. And now, back to it. After inspecting his traps, the mountain man crouched, hands wet, and reset a sprung trap. He stepped into the water, masking his scent, washing himself from the land. Beavers were smart. Smell the wrong thing, and they'd disappear. Also, before heading back, he'd splash water over his footprints. It was a small trick, but it kept him invisible. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, smoke drifted from the chimney like a fading breath. The world was waking. A loon called somewhere beyond the trees. Leaves rustled with something unseen. Another day. Another start. Next, he eyes a trail that wound through roots and stones, slick with dew along the stream. Nothing new, but still no place to lose focus. The weight of the knife on his belt, tomahawk across his back, and musket in his arm grounded him. At the stream's edge, he crouched. Water whispered past. A fish jumped. A frog splashed. But he was watching for other signs like shaved stumps, chewed saplings, slick slide marks shaped into the mud. Beavers had been busy. Good. He leaned down, still set. No movement, no bite. He frowned for half a second, then reset the brush and moved the trap just enough to cover it better. And now, nothing to do but move on. The next trap was near a willow patch, close to a lodge. Mud held fresh web tracks. He knelt. The chain was tight. Something was down there. He held it, then pulled it up slow. Water poured off the dark fur. The beaver kicked weakly, almost spent. Then, with one clean and quick strike, the struggling stopped. The mountain man whispered thanks under his breath, and that wasn't for show. He studied the pelt. It was thick, prime, would fetch a solid price back east. Thereafter, he reset the trap and camouflaged it with fresh mud and twigs before smearing more castoreum. Then he strapped the beaver to his pack. Trap by trap, he moved down the line. Some were full, some empty. He worked steadily. The sun edged higher, melting the cold from his coat. Birds kicked up noise in the trees. Squirrels darted through branches. Life everywhere, rushing beneath the quiet. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The land spoke back in its own ways. You just had to listen. And with the traps behind him and a beaver slung heavy over his shoulder, he turned back toward the cabin. The weight pressed into his back, but he didn't mind. All that mattered was that one more task had been done. One more piece of the grind. Outside the cabin, he hoisted the beaver onto a low-hanging branch. The cool air would keep it fresh until skinning time. No rush. Skinning was a job that needed calm hands and a sharp edge. Sloppy meant wasted pelt, and waste wasn't an option. He then grabbed the bucket by the cabin's entrance and headed for the stream again. He reached the bank, dipped the bucket, and filled it in one clean motion. Cold shot through his fingers, but he didn't care. Back inside, the cabin sat quiet and dim. Light snuck through the log seams in pale streaks. He set the bucket by the hearth where the last embers still glowed. And from the shelf, he pulled down his whetstone. Novaculite, hard, clean, and prized. After all, no trapper worth his salt skimped on his edge. He sat, laid the knife across his lap, bone handle smooth from years of use. He dunked the stone, wetted it good, then drew the blade across in steady strokes. Back and forth. A soft hiss. And when he was done, he tested the edge against his arm. Hair shaved clean. Good enough. He stood and swept the floor with a broom made from tied twigs, brushed away dust, ash, scraps. He then put tools in place, stacked hides, checked the rifle. Everything had its spot, and with things in place, he fed the hearth a few logs. The flame caught, and fire came back slowly, throwing heat into the cabin. He sat again, muscles unwinding. There was no need to speak. The fire did that. Cracks and pops in the quiet, mixing with the sounds of the wild outside. Plenty more to do, but for now, he let the warmth settle in. The day was still young. Part 3, Midday. By noon, his morning traps had paid off. 1 beaver, a fox, and 2 muskrats. Clean kills. He lugged them back without a word, the weight familiar. Outside the cabin, he braced himself for the art of skinning. And so, with knife in hand, he got to work. 1 cut from tail to lip. Neat, straight. He peeled the hide nice and steady, not rushing the blade. The underfur glowed, This was very valuable. A miscut would cost him. He rolled the carcass, worked the edge, and finished clean. Next, the muskrats, then the fox. Smaller game, different method. He strung each one up by the hind legs, cut around the ankles, and pulled the skin down like peeling a sock. It took force. The skins were delicate. And as always, one tear, and they were worthless. He then laid out each pelt across a wooden frame, lashed tight with rawhide. He leaned the frames against the cabin wall, angled just right to catch sun and breeze. He smoothed out creases, checked for tears, made sure nothing sagged. Those pelts were his currency, his only reason for existing out here. The meat didn't go to waste. Later on, he'd butcher what was left and carve what he needed. The beaver tail, especially, was rich and fatty. This he tossed nearby to prepare after sorting out the hides first. And now, he'll cut a slim willow branch, bend it into a hoop, and then tie it with sinew. The frame would stretch the beaver hide even. He'd do the same for the others. No shortcuts. He took the beaver pelt first, laid it fur down across the willow hoop. And with a bone awl, he punched holes around the edge. Steady hand, even spacing. No guessing. Rawhide strips followed, threaded tight through each hole, lashing the hide flat against the frame. No slack, no wrinkles. Uneven stretch meant rot. Once secure, he leaned the hoop against the cabin wall, angled just right to catch sun and breeze. Same for the muskrat, same for the fox. One pelt, one frame. He ran his hands over each, checking once more for folds or pulls. He then adjusted any tension and rechecked. Drying usually took days, and in that time, he'd keep watch. Sunlight, airflow, and patience did the work, but only if you kept an eye on them. One careless day, and a pelt could spoil. But in the meantime, with the hide set, he turned to the enticing meat. As mentioned earlier, the beaver tail was a fatty, prized delicacy. It got special treatment. The mountain man cleaned it first, then stripped the scaly skin, then scrubbed off the musk, and then into a brine of salt and vinegar overnight. Soak it right, and it'll cook clean. And tomorrow, he'd simmer it slow with baking soda to soften the flesh. Then pan-fry it in butter, mustard, and a splash of wine. A rare feast indeed. Rich, heavy, real frontier comfort food. The rest of the meat, lean cuts from the beaver, muskrat, and fox, he sorted and trimmed. Some he'd eat now. The rest needed to last. So he prepped the smokehouse. It was basically a squat log hut, mud-packed to hold in heat. Inside, he tied strips of meat to wooden beams. There, he'd space them wide. No crowding. Good air meant good curing. Then he lit the pit and fed it hickory and applewood. The smoke climbed gently, wrapping the meat in a rich, sharp scent. That fire would smolder for days. The smoke would preserve and flavor every bite. But for now, the day was still young, and there was plenty of work left to do. Part 4, Afternoon. The sun hung low, cutting through pine and aspen with hard gold light. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called once and went quiet. At some point, the mountain man spotted game nearby and decided to head out for a quick hunt, planning to return before sunset. He paused for a moment. He then took in the sprawl of forest, the layered greens, the patchy brown, the boundless wild. The sun said he had hours to work. And so he aimed for a game trail he knew by heart, one worn into the woods by hooves and habit. The path narrowed quick. Laurel and chokecherry leaned in, branches clawing. He ducked low, moving quietly. Ball of the foot first, no slapping heels. His breath stayed relaxed, drawn deep through his nose, pine, wet moss, rot, and something else. A musk? Faint? Animal? Recent? He froze, dropped into a crouch, not thinking, just knowing. His eyes scanned the ground. There, under a fern, a print, small, sharp, missable if you weren't looking. He eased one knee into the dirt, hand hovering just above. Cloven, wide set, white tail, probably a doe, maybe not alone. He didn't guess how fresh, he only felt it. Edges soft, still wet, no crumble. Pine needles hadn't lifted back yet. She ran, not walked. He moved, half rising, eyes sweeping left. The tree line was still holding its breath. The tracks angled south-southeast, slipping down a shallow draw. Smart move, cover all around, easy slope, wind at her back. But the wind was unpredictable, whirling through trees. That gave him the edge. She wouldn't catch his scent unless it turned. And so he moved again, this time slower. Rifle cradled now, not slung. Left hand clearing bramble, guiding his way. Every 10 steps, stop, listen. There's always some squirrel rattling, some jay screaming. But when the woods go still, that's when it matters. Then, sign. Birch bark, scraped, not grazed, but chewed. Thin vertical grooves where deer teeth stripped the outer layer. The sap was still wet. She'd been feeding. She wasn't spooked yet. She was still close. The mountain man dropped low. He pressed a palm into a shaken patch of trail. He brought his fingers to his nose. Strong scent. Bitter. She'd bedded here, maybe an hour ago, likely heading toward water. Suddenly, he veered off trail. No straight pursuit. A trapper once told him, "Don't follow the deer. Flank the memory of where it went." So, he arced wide, gaining elevation. The rise gave him a view down the draw. Wind cut across his face. Perfect. Then, he stopped. Movement. Barely there. A twinkle behind young aspen. And with that, raised his rifle smoothly and silently without thought. No, it wasn't the doe. This was a yearling, small and twitchy, nibbling moss off a fallen log. Its legs were stiff, ears flicked, but it was calm. The mountain man held his breath. He didn't shoot. Not yet. The doe might be near. It might circle back. So he stayed still, eyes scanning every shadow, locking in every crack and movement in the land. A few paces off, another patch caught his eye. Leaves stripped, stems snapped, hooves deep in the soil. This time, it was a bigger print. Different story. He knelt by the brush, studying bite marks high up the branches. Nope, it wasn't deer. It was elk. Fresh. The mountain man changed course again, quietly and quickly. Another trail, another sign. And maybe, this time, meat. The slope turned mean. Vines snagged his legs. Ferns whipped his thighs. Every step fought him, the ground loose with rock and thick roots waiting to trip. He then moved slow and quiet, boots dodging dry twigs, eyes fixed on the ground ahead. The woods spoke, but he filtered it all out. The breeze, the bird calls, the twitch of branches overhead. What mattered was closer. A snap twig, a hair tuft caught in bark, musk on the wind. Each one whispered the same thing. He's close. Light dappled the trail in broken patches. So he kept climbing. Then, an opening. The trees thinned. A trail curved along the ridge. He stepped onto it, every muscle braced, every sense sharp. The wind shifted, and with it, scent. He froze. Something moved ahead, there. Behind a curtain of brush, an elk. Big? A bull. Antlers high, glinting with light. It grazed, unaware. The mountain man raised his Hawken rifle slow and steady. He took aim, held his breath, trigger ready. Then the wind betrayed him. The elk jerked upright, sniffing, ears twitching, eyes locking straight through the cover. Crash! It vanished in a heartbeat, branches snapping, hooves pounding. The mountain man didn't move, however. He simply lowered the rifle, exhaled, and listened. The hunt wasn't over. It only changed shape. He turned and tracked back, eyes scanning for fresh sign. The forest gave way to open light. A clearing spread out wide, basked in afternoon sun. He moved low, tight to the ground, moccasins brushing soft against the earth. Up ahead, a downed log. He dropped behind it. He waited. He watched. A herd, elk again. Moving slow through tall grass, coats blending into the golden meadow. The bull trailed behind. It had broad shoulders, antlers like a crown. The mountain man steadied his rifle. One breath in. Silence. Then, crack. The shot echoed like thunder through timber. The bull stumbled, legs folding, then dropped. The herd scattered, melting into trees. He didn't chase. He only listened and waited, then stood. He walked to the bull. It lay still. He knelt, nodded once, not out of pride, but respect. The meat would feed him, the hide would keep him warm, and nothing was taken lightly out here. If it were small game, he'd have hauled it back whole. But this bull? No chance. This had to be done right here. And so he pulled his Green River knife and got to work. From the sternum up, one clean cut. No rushing, no mess. He avoided the guts, slicing with care. His fingers slipped between skin and meat, knuckling efficiently and as fast as he could. Hide peeled back in sheets, red muscle steaming in the chill. He then laid the hide aside, good for tanning later. He then reached in, pulled organs loose, setting the liver and heart off to one side. Food? The rest? Trap bait. Something would come sniffing soon enough. He continued to move fast, but clean. Shoulders, hindquarters, back straps. In this unforgiving realm, survival isn't just a skill, it's a constant battle. And the most crucial fortress in that battle isn't a rifle or a knife, it's shelter. Not just any shelter, but a permanent haven against the killing cold, the driving rain, the scorching sun, and the things that stalk the night. A log cabin. Building one was a monumental task of sweat, skill, and sheer determination. But before the first axe blow fell, before the first log was notched, came a decision far more critical, one that could spell the difference between a secure winter refuge and a frozen tomb, choosing the perfect site. Where did a mountain man sink his roots in this vast, dangerous land? How did he read the subtle language of the terrain to find that one spot, that needle in a haystack, that offered the delicate balance of resources, defense, and sanctuary? It wasn't luck. It was a calculated science born of hard-won experience where a single misjudgment could be fatal. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Today, we delve into the lost art of choosing a cabin site like a mountain man. We'll uncover the critical factors they weighed, the dangers they avoided, and the instincts they honed to master the wilderness and carve out a life where few dared to tread. Part 1. The weight of decision. More than just logs. Imagine standing alone, hundreds, maybe thousands of miles from the nearest town. Your life depends entirely on your own wits, your rifle, your knife, and the meager supplies in your possibles bag. The vast, silent wilderness stretches to every horizon. Beautiful, yes, but utterly indifferent to your survival. In this world, the decision of where to build your cabin wasn't just about convenience. It was the cornerstone upon which your entire existence in that region would rest. A cabin was more than just four walls and a roof. It was a base camp for trapping expeditions that could last weeks or months. It was a workshop for repairing gear, tanning hides, and casting bullets. It was a fortress against blizzards that could rage for days on end. It was a larder for storing precious dried meat and supplies. And perhaps most importantly, it was a sanctuary, the one place in a hostile world where a man could let down his guard, if only for a moment, find warmth, and rest his weary body. Many greenhorns, fresh from the east and filled with romantic notions of frontier life, made fatal errors right here at the very beginning. They'd choose a spot based on a pretty view, or the first flat piece of ground they found near a stream, without considering the hidden dangers or the long-term necessities. They might build in a picturesque meadow, only to find it became a windswept freezer in winter or a mosquito-infested swamp in spring. They might build too close to a river that seemed gentle in August, only to have their home swept away by ferocious spring floods. Or they'd build in a dense forest, easy for timber, but find themselves blind to approaching danger, whether it be a grizzly bear or a less than friendly war party. The experienced mountain man knew better. He understood that the land itself held clues, warnings, and promises. He approached the selection of a cabin site with the same meticulous care he used when setting a beaver trap or stalking an elk. He wasn't just looking for a place to build, he was looking for a place to live, to thrive, to survive against all odds. He evaluated the landscape through a lens sharpened by countless near misses and the harsh lessons learned from those who didn't make it. Water, wood, game, security, shelter from the elements. These weren't items on a checklist, they were the interwoven threads of life itself. Let's break down how they weighed these critical factors. Part 2. Water is life. The first consideration. Above all else, a man needs water. It's the most fundamental requirement for life, and the mountain man was no exception. Finding a reliable, year-round source of clean water was almost always the first and most critical factor in selecting a cabin site. He wasn't just looking for any water. He needed a source he could depend on through scorching summers and frozen winters. A rushing river might seem ideal, but was it prone to violent floods in the spring thaw? That picturesque creek? Would it dwindle to a muddy trickle or freeze solid in January? A hidden spring, bubbling clear and cold from the mountainside, was often the most prized find. Springs were less likely to freeze completely, often maintained a consistent flow, and their water was typically pure. An experienced man would scout the area thoroughly. He'd look for signs of high water marks on trees and rocks near rivers and streams, nature's own warnings of flood potential. He'd examine creek beds, noting the size of the rocks and debris, which indicated the force of the water during peak flow. He'd observe the vegetation. Certain plants thrive in consistently damp soil, signaling a reliable water source nearby. He might even dig a test hole near a promising spot to see how quickly groundwater seeped in. Jim Bridger, a man whose name is synonymous with the Rocky Mountain fur trade, was known to favor locations near the headwaters of streams or close to reliable springs. He understood that higher elevations often meant purer water and less risk of the devastating floods that could plague lower valleys. The water source wasn't just for drinking, it was essential for cooking, for cleaning hides, and crucially, for trapping. Many of the most valuable fur-bearing animals, especially the beaver, the cornerstone of the fur trade economy, were aquatic. A cabin situated near good beaver habitat meant shorter, more efficient trapping lines. The presence of beaver dams themselves could be a good indicator of a stable water system. But proximity had its dangers too. Building too close could invite flooding or unwanted attention from animals drawn to the water. The ideal spot was often slightly elevated within easy carrying distance, perhaps a few hundred yards, of the water source, balancing access with safety. Without a reliable source of water, easily accessible year-round, no site, no matter how advantageous otherwise, could be considered viable. It was the non-negotiable foundation of survival. Part 3. Timber and fuel. Resources within reach. Once a reliable water source was identified, the next critical resource was wood. Lots of it? A log cabin, by its very nature, required a substantial supply of straight, sound timber, preferably within a reasonable distance, to minimize the back-breaking labor of felling, limbing, and hauling logs. The ideal trees were typically conifers like pine, spruce, or fir. These grew relatively straight, were easier to work with hand tools like the axe and adze, and offered decent insulation. Hardwoods were generally avoided for the main structure, as they were much heavier and harder to cut and shape, though they might be used for flooring, pegs, or furniture if available. The mountain man would carefully survey the surrounding forest. He wasn't just looking for any trees, he was assessing the quality and quantity. Were there enough mature, straight trees of the right diameter to build the cabin walls? Was the timber sound, free from rot or excessive knots? He'd look at the density of the forest. A sparse stand meant long hauls, while an overly dense, dark forest could be gloomy, damp, and hinder visibility for defense. Transporting logs, even short distances, was arduous work, often done with sheer muscle power, perhaps aided by a horse or mule if the trapper was fortunate enough to own one. Therefore, finding a site with good timber nearby was paramount. Ideally, the trees could be felled and skidded downhill towards the building site. But the need for wood didn't end with the cabin walls. An equally vital consideration was a long-term supply of firewood. A cabin in the high country could require a fire burning almost constantly for months during the winter, consuming a staggering amount of fuel. The mountain man needed access to not only green wood for construction, but also standing dead timber or fallen logs that could be easily cut and split for burning. Hauling firewood daily from miles away was simply not sustainable. He'd look for areas with a mix of mature trees for building and dead or downed wood for fuel. He'd also consider the type of wood available for burning. Hardwoods burn longer and hotter, while softwoods like pine burn quickly and produce more creosote, requiring more frequent chimney cleaning. The perfect site offered a balance, close enough to abundant timber and fuel resources to make construction and daily life feasible, but perhaps situated in a natural clearing or on the edge of the forest, rather than deep within it. This provided easier access, better sunlight, improved visibility, and reduced the immediate risk of fire spreading to the cabin from the surrounding woods. Having water and wood within easy reach formed the essential resource triangle for any prospective cabin site. Part 4. The larder nearby, hunting and trapping grounds. A cabin wasn't just a place to sleep, it was the center of the mountain man's operations. Its location needed to support his primary purpose, acquiring furs and sustaining himself. This meant evaluating the site's proximity to productive hunting and trapping grounds. Before settling on a spot, the mountain man would spend considerable time scouting the surrounding territory, reading the signs to gauge its potential. Was there evidence of deer, elk, or even bison herds frequenting the area? These large animals provided not only meat, but also hides for clothing, sinew for sewing, and bones for tools. He'd look for game trails, droppings, browse lines on shrubs, and natural salt licks that attracted animals. For the fur trapper, proximity to waterways teeming with beaver, otter, and mink was crucial. He'd examine streams and ponds for dams, lodges, slides, and tracks. A site that served as a central point for multiple trapping lines radiating outwards was highly desirable, minimizing travel time and maximizing efficiency during the trapping season. He also needed to consider the seasonal movements of game. An area abundant with elk in the summer might be completely empty once the heavy snows arrived, forcing the animals to migrate to lower elevations. The ideal location offered reasonably consistent access to game throughout the year, or was situated strategically along migration routes. However, there was a delicate balance to strike. Building too close to major game trails or prime hunting grounds could be counterproductive. Constant human presence might drive the animals away. More dangerously, it could attract large predators like grizzly bears and wolves, drawn by the scent of cooking fires, stored meat, or discarded carcasses. A cabin needed to be close enough for efficient hunting and trapping, but far enough away to maintain a degree of separation and avoid becoming a nuisance or a target. Fishing opportunities were also a factor. Rivers and lakes could provide a valuable supplementary food source, especially during leaner times. The presence of fish indicated a healthy ecosystem, which often correlated with good hunting and trapping as well. The mountain man wasn't just looking for a place with animals. He was looking for a strategic location within a larger ecosystem that he could sustainably harvest. He needed a larder nearby, but one that wouldn't attract unwanted dinner guests. Part 5. Defending the cabin. Weather, predators, and hostilize. Survival in the mountains wasn't just about finding resources. It was about enduring the elements and staying safe from threats, both natural and human. The location of a cabin played a critical role in defense and security. Protection from the brutal weather was paramount. An experienced man would never build on an exposed ridgeline where the full force of winter winds could tear at the structure and suck the warmth from within. He'd avoid the very bottom of narrow valleys or hollows, which could become frost pockets, areas where cold air settled, making them significantly colder than the surrounding terrain and potentially prone to flash floods. Ideally, he sought a location with some natural shelter. The lee side of a hill, a spot nestled in a stand of timber, or a location shielded by rock outcroppings could offer significant protection from prevailing winds and drifting snow. He'd pay attention to the sun's path. A south-facing slope received more sunlight in winter, helping to melt snow and passively warm the cabin while offering some shade in the summer. Building on a slight elevation often provided better drainage, preventing the cabin floor from becoming a damp, muddy mess. Visibility was a double-edged sword. While seclusion could offer protection, being completely blind to the surroundings was dangerous. The mountain man needed to be able to spot approaching danger, whether it was a grizzly bear lumbering towards his meat cache or the glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel miles away. Many cabins were situated to offer a commanding view of the immediate approaches, perhaps overlooking a valley or clearing while still being somewhat concealed from distant observation. Natural terrain features were often incorporated into the defensive strategy. Building with a steep hillside or cliff face to the rear limited the directions from which an attack could come. A river or dense thicket could serve as a natural barrier on one or more sides. Easy escape routes were also considered. Was there a hidden draw or patch of thick timber nearby where a man could slip away if overwhelmed? Defense wasn't just against the elements and animals. The frontier could be a lawless place. Encounters with hostile Native American groups, or even desperate and unscrupulous white men, were a constant possibility. A well-chosen site was often inconspicuous, located off main trails, difficult to spot from a distance. Some mountain men went to great lengths to conceal their cabins, choosing hidden valleys or dense groves. Choosing a site was a complex calculation of risk and benefit, balancing the need for resources with the need for shelter and security. It required an intimate understanding of microclimates, terrain, and potential threats. Part 6. The Hidden Haven: Accessibility versus Seclusion. Beyond the immediate needs of water, wood, game, and defense, the mountain man had to consider the cabin's place within the larger landscape. How accessible did it need to be? Or how secluded? This often depended on the individual and his role in the fur trade. Was he a company man, an engagé, needing to stay within reasonable distance of established forts or rendezvous points to deliver his furs and receive supplies? Or was he a free trapper, valuing independence and seclusion above all else, perhaps venturing into territories untouched by competitors? A site deep in the wilderness offered prime trapping and security through isolation, but it meant long, arduous journeys to trade furs and restock essentials like gunpowder, lead, traps, coffee, and tobacco. Pack animals, horses or mules, were essential for these long hauls, and the chosen cabin site needed to have adequate grazing nearby to sustain them, at least seasonally. The terrain surrounding the cabin also mattered. Could pack animals navigate the trails leading to and from it, especially when laden with heavy packs of furs? Conversely, a site closer to established routes or rendezvous locations offered easier logistics, but potentially faced more competition for resources and increased risk of unwanted encounters. Some mountain men established multiple cabins, a main base in a more secluded, resource-rich area, and smaller temporary line cabins along their trapping routes for overnight stays. The choice often reflected a personal philosophy. Men like Jedediah Smith, constantly pushing into new territories, might prioritize locations that served as strategic launching points for further exploration. Others, perhaps older or seeking a more settled existence, might prioritize long-term security and resource stability over ease of access to the outside world. Ultimately, the balance between accessibility and seclusion was another layer in the complex calculation of choosing a home. It required foresight, an understanding of the vast distances involved, and a clear assessment of one's own goals and tolerance for isolation. Part 7. Reading the Land, Instinct and Experience. Beyond the tangible factors of water, wood, game, and defense, there was an intangible element that separated the master woodsman from the novice: instinct. It was an almost sixth sense, honed by years spent living and breathing the wilderness, learning its rhythms, its dangers, and its subtle language. Choosing the perfect cabin site wasn't just about ticking boxes. It was about feeling the land. An experienced mountain man could walk into a valley and sense things that a newcomer would completely miss. He could read the story told by the direction of the prevailing winds in the twist of the trees, gauge the severity of winters by the scars on the landscape, and predict the behavior of local wildlife by signs invisible to the untrained eye. He learned to trust his gut. Sometimes a site might look perfect on paper. Good water, plenty of timber, abundant game signs. But something just felt wrong. Maybe it was an unusual silence in the woods, a lack of birdsong, or a subtle feeling of being watched. The veteran mountain man learned to heed these warnings, even if he couldn't articulate the exact reason. This intuition wasn't mystical. It was the subconscious processing of thousands of tiny environmental cues filtered through years of experience. He would spend time in a potential area, observing it through different times of day and varying weather conditions. How did the sun track across the sky? Where did the shadows fall? How did the wind funnel through the terrain? Where did the snow accumulate most deeply? He'd watch the animals, their trails, their bedding areas, their reactions to his presence. They were the true natives, and their behavior offered invaluable insights into the area's character. Consider the legendary John Coulter, who survived his incredible naked run from the Blackfeet. His later choices of campsites and routes were undoubtedly informed by that brutal experience, prioritizing defensibility and escape routes perhaps more than others. Or think of Osborne Russell, whose journals provide such a rich account of mountain life. His detailed observations of flora, fauna, and weather patterns demonstrate the deep level of environmental literacy these men possessed. They didn't just live on the land, they lived with it in constant dialogue. The incredible stories of men like Coulter and Russell truly capture the spirit of the mountain man era. If you want to dive deeper into their harrowing experiences and valuable insights, be sure to check out our episodes detailing John Coulter's legendary escape and the fascinating life documented in Osborne Russell's journal. You'll find the links in the description. This deep connection, this ability to read the landscape and trust hard-earned instincts, was the final crucial element. It allowed the mountain man to synthesize all the logical factors: water, wood, game, defense, access, and overlay them with an intuitive understanding of place, ultimately leading him to that one spot where he could build his haven and make his stand against the wilderness. Choosing where to build a cabin was arguably one of the most important decisions a mountain man ever made. It was far more than selecting a plot of land. It was an act of profound engagement with the environment, a strategic calculation for survival, and a statement of intent to endure in a world that constantly tested the limits of human resilience. The perfect site offered a delicate equilibrium: abundant resources balanced with security, shelter balanced with awareness, accessibility balanced with seclusion. Finding that balance required keen observation, practical knowledge, physical endurance, and that intangible, hard-won instinct for reading the land. These hidden cabins scattered across the vastness of the American West were the anchors of the fur trade era. They were the lonely outposts from which trails were blazed, fortunes in fur were sought, and the map of a continent was slowly, painstakingly filled in. The wisdom employed in choosing their locations speaks volumes about the skills and mindset of the men who built them, a testament to their ability to not just survive, but to truly master the wilderness. Understanding how they made these critical decisions gives us a deeper appreciation for their resourcefulness and their intimate connection to the natural world. It's a connection that, in many ways, we strive to rediscover today. If you found this look into cabin site selection fascinating, you might also want to check out our previous video, Mastering the Wilderness: How Mountain Men Built Their Cabins, where we dive into the actual construction process. And for more on the tools that made it all possible, don't miss 7 essential survival tools that kept frontiersmen alive. What do you think was the most critical factor in choosing a cabin site? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Wild America, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of frontier life. Thanks for watching. The wind howls outside, rattling the greased paper window, but inside, there's a different kind of quiet. The quiet of a space carved from the wilderness, held together by sweat, grit, and the sheer will to endure. This isn't just 4 walls and a roof, it's a sanctuary, a fortress against the unforgiving wild. We've talked about how these mountain men built their cabins, a monumental task we explored in detail in our episode Mastering the Wilderness, raising log walls against the elements. But a cabin isn't truly a home until it holds the shape of a life lived within it. And for the solitary trapper, the long hunter, that meant filling the space not with store-bought comforts, but with pieces built by his own 2 hands. Forget fancy workshops and polished finishes. We're talking about furniture born from necessity, crafted with the same basic tools used for survival. An axe, a knife, maybe an auger if he was lucky. Pieces as rugged and resilient as the men who made them. A place to sit besides the cold dirt floor, a surface to eat on, a bed to keep off the damp ground. How did they turn raw logs and rough planks into functional furniture? What ingenious tricks did they use when resources were scarce and every ounce of energy mattered? How did the simple act of building a stool or a table become an extension of their fight for survival? My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Tonight, we're stepping inside that 1800s mountain man cabin. We're picking up the tools, feeling the grain of the wood, and uncovering the lost art of crafting furniture when you had nothing but the wilderness and your own resourcefulness. This is furniture built by hand, built for survival. Part 1, The Empty Cabin. Need Meets Ingenuity. Imagine stepping into that freshly built cabin for the first time. The scent of raw pine or cedar hangs heavy in the air. The walls stand solid, a testament to weeks, maybe months, of backbreaking labor. The roof overhead promises shelter from the biting wind and driving snow. It's an achievement, no doubt. But it's also empty. A man could sleep on a pile of firs or pine boughs on the dirt floor, and many did, especially at first. He could eat standing up or crouched by the fire pit. But survival wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about creating a space, however crude, where a man could rest, repair his gear, and simply be. The first need was often the simplest, a place to sit. Hunkering on the cold, damp earth day after day wasn't just uncomfortable. It could leach the warmth right out of you. A simple log section, perhaps flattened on top with an axe, might suffice temporarily. But a true mountain man, settling in for a season or longer, would soon crave something more stable, something built. Then came the need for a surface. Skinning a beaver, cleaning a rifle, preparing a meal. Doing these tasks on the floor was inefficient and messy. A rough table, even just a sturdy plank raised on legs, made all the difference. It brought order to the chaos, a small island of utility in the vast wilderness. And sleep. While a bed might seem like a luxury, raising oneself off the cold, potentially damp ground was crucial for health and retaining body heat, especially during the brutal winters. A simple raised platform, a bunk built into the wall. These weren't about comfort in the modern sense. They were about conserving energy and staying healthy enough to face the next day's challenges. Storage, too, became essential. Where to keep the precious powder dry, the traps organized, the few personal belongings safe, rough shelves mounted on the walls, simple pegs driven into the logs, perhaps a crude box or chest. These weren't just conveniences. They were vital for maintaining gear and sanity. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about function, pure and simple. Every piece of furniture had to justify its existence through utility. It had to be buildable with the limited tools at hand, using readily available materials. This intersection of stark necessity and raw ingenuity is where the story of mountain man furniture truly begins. The empty cabin wasn't just a space to be filled, it was a problem to be solved, a challenge to be met with axe, knife, and unwavering determination. Part 2. The Mountain Man's Toolkit, Forging Function from Few. So, the need was clear. An empty cabin demanded furnishing. But how? A mountain man didn't have a workshop stocked with specialized tools. He had what he carried, what he could trade for, or what he could forge himself. His toolkit was lean, multifunctional, and brutally effective, designed for survival first, craftsmanship second. The cornerstone, as always, was the axe. We often think of it for felling trees or splitting firewood, essential tasks we covered when discussing cabin building. But in skilled hands, the axe was also a shaping tool. It could roughly flatten a log surface for a bench, hew a plank for a tabletop, or even begin the process of carving out a rough joint. It wasn't precise, but it was powerful, the first step in taming raw timber. Next, the knife. More than just a weapon or a skinning tool, a mountain man's knife was his most versatile implement. He'd use it for finer shaping where the axe was too crude, smoothing edges, carving notches, whittling pegs, scraping surfaces. A sharp, sturdy blade could perform a surprising range of woodworking tasks, demanding patience and control. If he was fortunate, he might possess a draw knife. This two-handled blade, pulled towards the user, was incredibly efficient at removing wood quickly and relatively smoothly. Perfect for flattening surfaces, shaping legs for stools or tables, or tapering pegs. It offered more control than an axe for shaping larger pieces. Holes were crucial for joining pieces together, especially without nails or complex joinery. An auger, essentially a large drill bit, often turned with a simple wooden handle or later a brace, was invaluable. It allowed the mountain man to bore holes for legs on a stool, for pegs to hold shelves, or to start the process of creating a mortise joint. Owning an auger, even a small one, significantly expanded his furniture-making capabilities. Less common, perhaps, but incredibly useful was the adze. With its blade set perpendicular to the handle, like a hoe, it was used for rough shaping concave surfaces, like hollowing out a log section to create a trough or bowl, or even shaping the seat of a crude chair. It was a specialized tool, often associated more with coopering or boat building, but a resourceful man could adapt it. Chisels, hand planes, saws. While saws existed and were used in settlements or for major logging, a lone mountain man was less likely to haul a large saw deep into the wilderness just for furniture. Small frame saws might be possible, but often the axe and knife did the cutting. Chisels and planes were tools of finer woodworking, generally beyond the scope of basic survival furniture built quickly with minimal gear. This limited toolkit dictated the style: simple, robust, and relying on clever joinery that could be achieved with basic means. Peg joints, simple notches, maybe a crude mortise, and tenon if an auger and knife were used skillfully. There was no room for delicate ornamentation, only the beauty of raw function. Building furniture with these tools wasn't just woodworking, it was a testament to human adaptability, forcing creativity through constraint. Every piece held the marks of the tools, the sweat of the maker, and the story of survival. Part 3. From Log to Living, Crafting the Essentials. Armed with basic tools and driven by necessity, the mountain man began to transform the raw materials around him into the essential pieces that would make his cabin livable. It wasn't about beauty contests. It was about function, stability, and getting the job done before the next storm rolled in or the next hunt called. Perhaps the first piece beyond a simple log section was the three-legged stool. Why 3 legs? Stability. On an uneven dirt or rough plank floor, 3 legs will always find a solid footing, unlike a 4-legged chair that would wobble incessantly. The seat itself might be a cross-section of a suitably sized log, perhaps slightly flattened on top with an axe or adze for comfort. The real ingenuity lay in attaching the legs. Using an auger, the mountain man would bore 3 holes into the underside of the seat, angled outwards for stability. The legs themselves, sturdy branches or split sections of wood, would be roughly shaped with a knife or draw knife, tapering one end to fit snugly into the drilled holes. Sometimes the tapered end, the tenon, would be driven through the hole and a small wedge hammered into a split at the top, locking it permanently in place, a simple but incredibly strong wedged tenon joint. No glue, no screws, just friction and clever mechanics. Simple? Yes. Crude? Absolutely, but it kept a man off the cold ground. It was a place to rest weary bones after a long day on the trap line. It was a victory, however small, over the raw wilderness. For more seating or for a surface to place gear, a bench was the next logical step. Often this was made from a split log, a technique called riving. A log would be split lengthwise using wedges and an axe or mallet. The flat split side became the top surface, perhaps smoothed further with an axe or draw knife. The rounded bark side faced down. Legs could be attached similarly to the stool. 4 holes drilled into the underside of the split log, angled outwards, with sturdy branches or split wood sections shaped and driven in. These benches were heavy, solid, and could serve multiple purposes: seating by the fire, a place to lay out pelts, or even a temporary workbench. The table represented another leap in cabin civility. Eating meals, repairing gear, writing a rare letter, a stable, flat surface was invaluable. Creating a wide, flat top was the biggest challenge with limited tools. Sometimes a particularly wide log could be split and the top surface painstakingly flattened with an axe, adze, or draw knife. Alternatively, several narrower split logs or rough-hewn planks could be laid side by side. Attaching legs required stability. 4 legs were common, often attached, using the same pegged or wedged tenon method used for stools and benches, with the legs angled for support. Sometimes a simpler trestle-style support might be fashioned. 2 uprights connected by a crossbar at each end, with the tabletop resting on top. Again, the joinery was dictated by the tools available. An auger made pegged legs feasible. Without one, simpler solutions were needed. These weren't elegant dining tables. They were often uneven, marked by the tools, stained by use. But they were there. They were surfaces wrested from the forest, providing a focal point for the simple, often solitary life within the cabin walls. Each gouge from the axe, each shaving from the draw knife told a story of resourcefulness. Beyond seating and tables, other simple additions emerged. Pegs driven into drilled holes in the log walls provided crucial hanging storage for rifles, powder horns, clothing, and traps, keeping gear off the floor and organized. A simple shelf, perhaps a rough plank supported by pegs or crude brackets, offered a place for smaller items, food supplies, or the few personal treasures a man might possess. Stool, bench, table, pegs, shelves. These were the building blocks of a functional cabin interior. Each piece was a direct response to a need, crafted with minimal tools and maximum effort. It was a slow, deliberate process, filling the empty space not just with objects, but with the tangible results of self-reliance. The cabin was becoming less of a raw shelter and more of a personalized space, shaped by the hands of the man who called it home. Part 4. The Mountain Man's Bed. Beyond the bough pile. A man could survive sleeping on the ground, curled up in furs or blankets. Many did, especially when constantly on the move. But inside the relative permanence of a cabin, especially one meant to endure a harsh winter, getting off the cold, damp earth was more than just comfort. It was a crucial survival strategy. A raised bed conserved precious body heat and offered some protection from drafts and critters skittering across the floor. The simplest solution was often a built-in bunk. Using the cabin walls themselves for support, a mountain man could construct a sturdy frame with minimal materials. He might secure sturdy poles or split logs horizontally between two walls or into one corner, creating a platform. Auger-drilled holes and stout wooden pegs would be the primary method of attachment, locking the frame securely to the cabin structure. The platform itself needed a surface. If he had managed to hew relatively flat planks, those might be laid across the frame. More likely, he might use smaller, straight poles laid close together, creating a kind of rustic slatted base. The goal wasn't a perfectly smooth surface, but something solid enough to support bedding. Another ingenious technique involved using rawhide. If a man had recently processed a large animal like a buffalo or elk, the hide, once scraped, could be cut into strips. While still wet and pliable, these strips could be stretched tightly across the bed frame, lacing them back and forth like a rough webbing. As the rawhide dried, it would shrink and become incredibly taut and strong, creating a surprisingly resilient and slightly springy sleeping surface. We saw how crucial animal hides were for clothing in our buckskin episode, but their uses extended far beyond that. If building directly into the wall wasn't practical, a freestanding bed frame could be constructed. This was essentially a low rectangular frame, similar in construction to a simple table or bench, but larger. 4 sturdy legs, likely attached with pegged or wedged tenons into a frame made of poles or split logs. Again, the platform could be made of poles, rough planks, or stretched rawhide. What went on top? Not memory foam, that's for sure. A thick layer of dried grasses, leaves, or pine boughs could provide some insulation and cushioning. If he was lucky or had access to trade, a simple mattress ticking, a large sack made of canvas or rough linen, could be stuffed with straw, dried moss, or even cattail fluff for a more substantial bed. Over this would go the essential furs and blankets, buffalo robes, bearskins, trade blankets, piled thick against the biting cold. This wasn't a place of luxury. It was a functional necessity. The mountain man's bed, whether a built-in bunk or a simple frame, was another piece of the survival puzzle solved by hand. It represented a small but significant victory, a warm, dry place to rest and recover, readying the body and mind for whatever the wilderness would throw at him come sunrise. It was a piece of furniture that directly contributed to his ability to endure. Part 5. Boxes, Shelves, and Keeping Order. Taming the clutter. Life on the frontier generated clutter even for a man living simply. Traps needed storing, ammunition had to be kept dry and accessible, food supplies protected from pests, and personal items secured. A cabin floor piled high with gear wasn't just messy, it was inefficient and potentially dangerous. Finding or creating effective storage was another essential task solved with basic tools and available wood. A simple box or chest was incredibly useful. While complex dovetail joints were likely out of reach, a functional box could be made from rough-hewn planks. If a man had access to a saw, cutting planks to size was easier. Without one, he might painstakingly hew them flat with an axe and draw knife. Joining the corners could be done simply by overlapping the planks and securing them with wooden pegs driven into drilled holes. It wouldn't be airtight or elegant, but it would create an enclosed space. Hinges and latches were another challenge. Metal hinges were trade goods, not always available. A simple solution was a leather strap hinge, where a tough piece of hide was nailed or pegged across the lid and body of the box. Alternatively, wooden hinges could be fashioned, perhaps a simple pivot pin design, where a rounded extension on the lid fit into a hole in the box side. Latches might be as simple as a rotating wooden toggle or a leather strap and buckle. These boxes protected valuable gear from dirt, moisture, and casual view. A sturdy box could also double as extra seating or a small table surface, maximizing utility in the cramped cabin space. Shelves offered open, accessible storage. The simplest form involved driving sturdy wooden pegs into the log walls and laying a rough plank or split log across them. Accuracy in drilling the holes ensured the shelf sat level. These were perfect for keeping tin cups, plates, small sacks of flour or salt, and other frequently used items within easy reach and off the floor. We saw the importance of pegs for hanging gear like rifles and powder horns earlier, but their utility extended further. Rows of pegs could hold clothing, cooking utensils, or bundles of drying herbs. They were the simplest storage solution, requiring only an auger and some sturdy branches, but incredibly effective at utilizing vertical wall space. Occasionally, a man with more time or skill might attempt a small wall cabinet. This would likely be a simple box structure, perhaps with a pegged door mounted directly to the log wall. It offered more protected storage than open shelves, suitable for smaller, more valuable items, or perhaps the few precious spices or medicinal supplies he possessed. Items we know were crucial from tales of frontier medicine. Boxes, shelves, pegs. These weren't just about tidiness. They were about efficiency and preservation. Keeping gear organized meant finding it quickly when needed. Protecting food and powder meant ensuring survival through the next lean period or dangerous encounter. By building these simple storage solutions, the mountain man wasn't just furnishing his cabin. He was imposing a small measure of order onto the wild chaos outside its walls, making his solitary existence more manageable, one hand-built piece at a time. Part 6. The Soul of the Cabin, More Than Just Wood. Look around this space. The rough-hewn stool standing firm on the uneven floor, the sturdy bench bearing the scars of countless meals and tasks, the table holding a simple tin cup, the bunk promising rest, the shelves and pegs bringing order. This isn't just a collection of wooden objects, it's the physical manifestation of a man's struggle against and adaptation to the wilderness. Each piece, built by hand with rudimentary tools, represents a small victory, a pushback against the chaos and indifference of nature. It's the difference between merely surviving and living. Building this furniture wasn't a hobby. It was an integral part of the mountain man's existence. The same hands that set traps, skinned beaver, and fired a Hawken rifle were the hands that shaped these stools and tables. The skills were intertwined. Knowing the wood, understanding its grain, its strengths, its weaknesses. This was part of reading the landscape, just like tracking game or predicting weather. For the solitary trapper, spending months or even years with little human contact, these hand-built items became silent companions. They were extensions of himself, imbued with his effort, his resourcefulness, his presence. The chair wasn't just a chair. It was his chair, built to fit his needs, bearing the marks of his labor. It grounded him in a world that was constantly shifting, dangerous, and vast. There's an honesty to this furniture, no pretense, no unnecessary decoration. Every element serves a purpose. The angled legs provide stability, the thick planks offer strength, the simple joints hold fast. It speaks of a time when utility was paramount, when resources were respected, and when the connection between human hands and natural materials was direct and profound. Today, we might look at replicas or museum pieces and see only crude, rough objects. But look closer. See the axe marks, the whittled pegs, the sheer ingenuity. This wasn't just furniture. It was survival made tangible. It was the soul of the cabin, built piece by painstaking piece, by hands that knew the true meaning of self-reliance. It was the quiet testament of a life lived on the edge, built by hand, in the heart of wild America. Thanks for joining us inside the mountain man's cabin. If you're fascinated by the resourcefulness of these pioneers, be sure to check out our episodes on how they built the cabins themselves, the tools they relied on, and the brutal medical hacks they used to survive. Let us know in the comments what aspect of frontier life you'd like us to explore next. Until then, stay wild.